So my name is Gustavo. As Dorina said, I come from Brazil. And today I'm going to be talking about recent work I've been doing on research. And I organized this presentation to summarize a bit of these past works. And I call it Describing Socio-Spatial Inequalities with Fine-Scale and Network-Centered Approaches. So I'm a PhD candidate and a lecturer in Brazil. And I'm part of a research group which studies urban phenomena through network theory. So this is where I am coming from here. So my presentation is going to be about mainly two papers that were published earlier this year. The first one in Environment and Planning B, and the second one, Brazilian Journal of Urban Management. And both of them are related and about social spatial inequalities and segregation in Brazil. Now, social spatial segregation can be understood generally as the isolation or separation of social groups when it comes to their residential location in urban space. Now, depending on the national context or regional or city context, we can think about segregation based on income, ethnicity, religion, occupation, educational level, or household structure groups, right? But since I'm talking about Latin American cities, there are three main factors that I should point out which are really defining the spatial structure of fragmented Latin American cities. So for us, proximity to transport infrastructure plays a key role in determining housing prices because of the strong social inequalities. There's a large number of gated communities for high and upper middle class. So this phenomenon that we call self-segregation, where the population which has the power to decide where they can locate themselves in terms of residential locations, they choose to segregate themselves. And the access to poorer communities are sometimes, or most of the times, I would say, restricted by walls or informal ways of separation. So here we have two examples of two emblematic cities in Brazil. On the left side, São Paulo, and on the right side, Rio de Janeiro, where we have high-income neighborhoods very close to informal, low-income settlements, but actually they are not closed at all because they are either separated by gates or natural features. The traditional way of looking at the phenomenon of segregation is through residential segregation, which is more focused on the separation of groups, of social groups, based on their housing locations, as I said. But in our work, we are focusing mainly in multidimensional segregation, where we're trying to look at the potential interactions between individuals and urban activity spaces. So not only where people live, but also how they interact with each other and with the possibilities that the urban life offers. So in multidimensional segregation, residential segregation is an input and not the result, let's say. And we look at the idea of multidimensional segregation through the conceptual framework of spatial accessibility. It can be divided, let's say, in three main domains. So the social groups on one side where people live, the desired destinations, so the places that people want or are willing to reach in the city. And what separates these two locations, the urban form and the transportation network. So social groups can be divided according to different stratification criteria. The desired destinations are the activity spaces, so the jobs, schools, hospitals, leisure facilities, and many others. And of course, these two are divided or separated by distances, which can be described by the street network, the network of streets we have in our cities, and the transportation network that, of course, has to do with different modes of transportation. Now, we look at the idea of spatial accessibility by two properties of networks. Maybe some scholars will be familiar with this, so we look at it through the properties of betweenness and closeness. Now here are two maps of London that illustrate what these two properties capture from networks. So betweenness have more to do with the capacity of certain streets to intermediate connections between distant locations, as we can see on the top map. While closeness has more to do with the proximity that places have between one another. So based on these two properties, let's say we develop two indicators. The first one based on betweenness, which is potential movement, and the second one is based on closeness, which is potential accessibility. Now, these indicators, they capture network properties, but they're also weighted with data related to population or the social groups and destinations, which are facilities and amenities, trying to capture these three domains of spatial accessibility. So not to elongate myself that much, I would like to show you some results from a medium-sized city in southern Brazil, which are related to the second indicator, so the accessibility index. So this is a summary of what the city looks like. It's in the southernmost part of Brazil. And on the right side, it's the division of city regions in the city. And this heat map shows the concentration of facilities within the central district, which is indicated by the number 4. So we have a high concentration of facilities in the city core. Here we have some maps illustrating the distribution of social groups. Here for two different criteria, so on the top, income groups, and in the bottom, race groups. We can see that there's this very clear tendency of a central periphery distribution where high income individuals are located closest to the core of the city, and low income population is scattered around the city in residual areas. A similar situation happens to the non-white population here in the bottom. Now these maps, they summarize our analysis and they try to illustrate the accessibility inequalities between groups. So what you see here is a map of street segments, and the red colors, they indicate where each of the groups' accessibility is higher than the average. And on the other hand, the blue colors indicate where the group's accessibility is lower than the average. So what we can see here for each of the groups is that the most vulnerable groups, so the low income and the non-white groups, reach higher accessibilities away from the city center or the city core where most facilities are located. And the opposite happens to the high income and white population, having their highest accessibility levels on the city center where most facilities are located. Now here we're looking at the results, more looking at the numbers. So this graph shows the colored bars. They show the different heights mean higher or lower accessibility, and the different colors illustrate different groups. And they're also separated according to the city regions. And in the center of the chart, we have more central areas in the city. What we can see there is that the high-income group has a peak of accessibility in the central district, and the vulnerable group, so the low-income and the non-white individuals, they have they don't have high levels of accessibility in the city overall, and they only reach higher accessibility levels in areas which are away from the city center. Now, until this point in our research, we already understood that white high-income groups are more favored, but we wanted to understand within the more favored and the less favored which ones performed better when it comes to accessibility. And what we found out was a really interesting situation. So what we compared was the white population with the high-income population and the non-white with the low-income population. So when we look here at the left side, the left map, it's a similar interpretation. So the red colors mean where the high-income group performs better than the white, and on the other side is where the red means where the low-income group performs better than the non-white. So what we can see is that the high-income group, when compared to the white population, they maintain their status of a good performance in terms of accessibility. But when we look at the less favored groups, the non-white and the low-income groups, we can see that the results are a little ambiguous, meaning that there's no clear distinction between who is better or less served by urban facilities, which leads us to the maybe sad interpretation of these results, which probably we can see here a segregation pattern where non-white and low-income groups are the same. They are intersectional groups. So to not elongate myself that much, what I would like to maybe give to you as future possibilities and possibilities for the index utilization is that this is useful for comprehension of inequalities in levels of accessibility and potential movement for different social groups. And also, as I just showed you with the previous maps, possibilities of understanding different segregation patterns which are beyond residential locations. So looking at what I was explaining before, the idea of multidimensional segregation. And also the possibility of simulating future scenarios, which I think has a lot to do with Yulisa was saying yesterday about the unpredictability that we have in our cities. And I kind of want to advocate here for a more live monitoring kind of policy making, rather than things that we do once and we will think about it again in the next 5 years. So our indexes, they could be useful to help simulate these future scenarios. For example, thinking about the implementation of new job centers, new settlements, and even changes in the street network, which will change how the accessibility inequalities are distributed along the city. And I think here as a contribution to think about our cities in a more just mindset. So thanks a lot, and thanks for the attention and for listening.